My timing is right. I'd made it north across the 49th parallel, just as the border guards were fussing with the barrier. Now it's half midnight, and I coast the pickup down the slope at Woods Bay and roll on to the night's final ferry crossing westward over Kootenai Lake. Life should happen at the last minute. A decade had passed by since I'd departed the farm we called Bright Clearing and struck out in black crushed velvet pants and a Greek boy permanent wave to become a famous sitcom writer in Los Angeles, rented a Fleabag apartment in Hollywood, and lay in bed at night watching the spotlights of the police helicopters pierce the darkness of the alleys alongside the building. Sirens blaring, and the fragrance of burning jacaranda blossoms and gasoline choking on the stench of evil and fresh blood. I awake one night from a roving nightmare in which Ed McMahon is traducing me on The Tonight Show. I am naked, and he chortles lowly as he snips off my scrotum and holds it up for America to see. Here, he says, use this to carry your change. I disappeared into the rest of the 70s. Taos, Fayetteville, Lauderdale, Savannah, and then the 80s, Georgetown, Brooklyn Heights, Cambridge. I never did get famous. And renaming myself, at last, I landed up by the pit in Butte, America, where I worked the graveyard at KBUT, K-Butt, top 40 country and western, not even on the FM dial. 10 years since I'd waved so long to Neil, the carpenter I had cherished too mutely. The bone of my own contention lacked fortitude, and so I'd punted with Janet, the moon-faced schoolteacher, helped her patch a taro quilt, which both of us lay under, warm but lonesome. Back then, there'd been 11 of us living on 80 acres in the southeastern corner of British Columbia. Neil, the carpenter, had a wife, Jill, and he couldn't keep her. Consensual gardening, she said once, is not at the top of my life list. She announced this sardonically one afternoon after we'd spent 5 hours hand-coating the tomatoes with a rhubarb poison intended to kill the cabbage worms. Jill could never tolerate our lengthy family meetings, nor the pastoral sentiments which so often prompted our daily lives. This is all too happy for me, she'd informed us one night after supper when we were all singing 5-part harmonies for the geese. It was hard to tell if the geese were entertained, but Janet had deduced that it would help their egg production. So Jill took her spleen and split, fled back to Vancouver for the clearer life of body techniques, muscular realignment, ice massage, high colonics. I am the only passenger on the boat this night. There is no moon, and the water and the surrounding mountain fastholds are a palette of black. The last of my 2 fumbling letters to Neil had been delivered 5 years past. His acknowledgement had been a postcard. Dear Rick, got your note. Thanks. Come back and play some cribbage. 15-2, 15-4, 15-6, and the rest don't mix. 19 in the crib. Hell, I wanted the right jack and double-double runs, all hearts. Now I'm off the ferry and driving north and west to tell Neil that I'd been remiss in not making my passions straightforward. I need to make these lamentations aloud. And perhaps none of this will matter now, but I do want to tell him, face to face, that what I had really needed was for him to be my sturdy staff, my life's carpenter. And it does not matter if there is nothing left to be salvaged from those old scraps of love's green timber. I negotiate the pickup off the ferry and up the cobbled steel ramp and head north along the forested edge of the lake. At the hot springs where we used to bathe, I encounter some doukhobors. I belly my way back into the pitch-black caverns beneath the rocks and squat there, invisible, listening to the whispering Russian words. I float through the steamy tunnels and brush past bodies resting in sandy crevices. This must be what it'd be like to touch an elephant's hind end. No acknowledgement, no sensation. It was Neil who'd first introduced me to the Doukhobors and their fires. We'd been driving home late one night over the mountain road from a barn dance at New Freedom when we saw a farmhouse blazing. We stopped and I leaped out and began rushing toward the fire. Neil called me back. "It's the spirit wrestlers," he explained. "Let them be. They don't need any help." Against the flames, I could see the silhouettes of men and women and children. They were removing their dresses, their overalls, and tossing them into the fire, running naked around the burning building, singing and shouting in a Slavic-sounding tongue. Neil explained. You see, their grandparents came from Russia right around 1900. Tolstoy helped them escape. He gave them all the royalties from Resurrection, the last novel he ever wrote. And Neil described their schismatic, plain-spoken Christianity, their loathing of the Orthodox Church, and the czars who had hounded them across the steppes of the motherland for 200 years. Neil passionately spun the story out. They named themselves spirit wrestlers, lived in communes, refused to take up arms. They wouldn't pay taxes or send their children to school. And finally, they turned into religious anarchists, burned their own houses and barns right to the ground, flipping off the patriarch and the czar. It's strange that anyone ever imagined they'd change when they got to Canada. I stared back at the flames and tingled at the nakedness of the big-breasted women and the barrel-chested men as Neil drove off with the headlights out, preserving a vestige of our own modesty. The Imperial Army, Neil went on, would come to steal their crops and draft the men. So the Doukhobors would raid the army's weapons cache. They'd melt the rifles on the pyres of their own homes and then depart to build another community hundreds of miles away. Finally, there was no geography left to escape to, and that was when Tolstoy and the Quakers helped them emigrate to Canada. In his cabin at Bright Clearing, Neil had an old sepia photograph of a score of Doukhobor women. The men, you see, were away building the Transcontinental Railroad, saving cash to buy horses. And the women were hitched to a plow, breaking the virgin prairie. But in Canada, the spirit wrestlers were just as trouble-ridden and trouble-giving as they had ever been in Russia. The farmhouse which Neil and I had seen ablaze had followed on the heels of the Canadian government trying to force some of their youngsters to go to public school where they would not be permitted to speak in their own tongue. I depart the hot springs and go to sleep scrunched up in the cab of my truck, but much later I'm startled awake by the sound of a shotgun. A man, all I can see is his mustache, is firing his shotgun at me. I cringe, and then he turns on the gun on himself. Kaboom! I come tumbling out of the truck, out of my nightmare, but I'm still cowering and can hear my own voice whimpering, "No, no, please." It's barely dawn. I avoid the small city of Nelson by driving the long way, up and over the graveled mountain pass. I recognize an old bearded man who is perched just where I had seen him last, on the porch of an isolated cabin at an abandoned mine site. We exchanged the slightest of waves and the merest nods, just as we had a long, long time ago, though we had no personal acquaintance. Down from the pass, I emerge on the road overlooking the narrow valley cut by the Slocan River. I drove south for 23 miles, and switchbacking down to the floor of the valley, I can see, just across the river, the red shingle roof of the community center we'd built the summer of 1975. Neil was the head carpenter, and some days there would be more than 50 of us swarming over the building as we rushed to beat the winter. I am elated now, returning to a souvenir I couldn't take along with me. Some folks do not enjoy being surprised, but I see it as an advantage. However Neil treats my verbal ablutions, at least I know he won't evade me. "Well, I'm here for the distance," he'd once said to me gravely, the morning I told him I could no longer resist responding to my ambitions. I had to take the temperature of the world of art commerce. "The mercury is my thermometer," he'd said, "and the mercury tells me it's a frigid out there, way below zero. Maybe that's why you've got a fever for it." I cross the river on the single-lane trestle bridge and begin to turn past the community center and up the narrow road toward the farm. Then I spot a little knot of people standing by the small pavilion Neil had built, apart from the larger building, at the edge of the river. And Neil had built this all by himself. "I want it for special occasions," he'd said, "baptisms and weddings and eulogies." Then I think I recognize Max's wispy white hair, his bony frame, and the way the morning sun is making his bifocals cast brilliant semaphores. Max was the eldest up at Bright Clearing, the pater familias. I feel shy now, discomfited. Hadn't expected to encounter them all in a little covey like this. I'd pictured myself avoiding the main farmhouse in the narrow gully at the foot of the property, scooting quickly through the woods like an Indian, and finding Neil alone up at his cabin on the ridge. I stopped the truck and walked toward them. Chris puts the bead on me before the others do. His big silent grin embraces my presence. Zach is playing his harmonica. Glenna, the farrier, is stepping back slowly from the small circle, looking skyward. I'd picked wildflowers for Glenna and Chris the day they got married. Their romance was a minor sensation then. She was not quite 30, and he was a skinny 19. Max is now pouring some dirt out of a jug into the river. He is an architect, a widower, who got that title very suddenly at a cocktail party in Edmonton when his wife stepped through a glass door and a small shard of glass pierced her aorta. This had happened many years before I'd met him, but I'd always thought he'd constructed his grieving like a craftsman, worn it like a piece of polished walnut. "I'm happy you could make it," Chris whispers. "Make it?" And then I listened as Max intones, "Neil was the chief carpenter on this building. He had a faith in his hands, a faith which stands right there." He gestures toward the stone and timbered building where the whole valley would come out to reel and jig. Our sadness is that Neil did not have enough faith in his own heart. I know the past tense when I hear it, and realize that the dirt that Max is pouring is actually Neil's ashes, which each of them then, in turn, is scattering into the river. I do not like the compact coldness of Max's eulogy. I do not want a turn at the disposal, and I sidle over toward Glenna, who is standing apart from everyone else, and who is also studiously avoiding the urn. "What happened?" I ask. Her reply is whispered but fierce and angry. "We went to Vancouver for Christmas last winter, and when we got back, Neil's head, it was splattered all over the goddamn kitchen like some final insult for an injury we didn't even know we'd done, and we'd never have a chance to rebuke him. He could have shot his brains out in his own place, but no way was he going to mess up that precious little A-frame of his." I begin to quiver and shiver. It took a week to scrub his blood off the walls. A few weeks later, we brought in the old crowd, Frank and his boys, Julie and Ursula and them, just the old friends, and we exorcised the house, burned sage, cleansed it of Neil's bad blood. Jesus Christ, Rick, I never did anything to Neil. Nobody asks why I am here. Assume I'd somehow heard about this ceremonial closure, I suppose. I rely on my scout's honor face to conceal the cold trembling inside my belly. Soon we are all up in the farmhouse, inside the now exorcised kitchen where once we drunk home brew, where we caterwauled and baked bread and argued politics, gone over the accounts, done the canning. Neighbors from up and down the valley are dropping in and out, although there seems to be an awkward agreement that memories of Neil are to be kept to a minimum. But Max warms a bit, negotiates me into a cubbyhole, and fills me in on the remainder of our family, who, like myself, have long since departed for different lives in other places. Janet, my bedmate, is planting trees in Africa. Jill, the wife who wouldn't keep, who did not like fetching pails of water, had been informed, of course. She couldn't make it over, Max explained. She's leading a major workshop this weekend in Vancouver. I am surprised to learn that Glenna and Chris and their small daughter are the only ones remaining on the place. Max and Zach had come over from Vancouver just for this occasion. Zach and Chris pressed me for my other worldly news. They thought I must still be living in the Hollywood fast lane, and were surprised to learn I'd been holed up in Montana for a few years. Zach gave me his impish wink. Well, when are you going to come back and live in the time before Christ? This is how we all had renominated BC, British Columbia, before Christ, when we had, back then, all of us yearned for an Eden. Finally, I can no longer ignore the obvious. What happened? What went wrong? But Zach merely shrugs his shoulders, and Chris's eyes narrow. There is a 5 o'clock kind of a silence, which I break out of by following Ursula, one of the longtime neighbors, out to the duck pond. She stands there rocking her baby, and I take a genuflective posture as she responds to my questions. Neil was terribly lonesome, is all I know. Jill never came back, but she never divorced him neither. He just sort of let all that simmer. He always believed she'd return someday. Ursula opens her blouse and gives the child her breast. Neil spent a lot of time with me last fall. Frank was away logging a lot, and I was waiting for the new baby. Neil would ski through the woods, and we'd play cribbage and read plays out loud. We laughed a lot. Did Neil ever mention me? I asked. We always talked about you. How bonkers you were. I thought you'd have been famous by now. She moved the child to her other breast. But everything had changed. You were only the first to go. And after another year or 2 or 3, it was just Glenna and Chris and their little one down in the farmhouse. And they got very nuclear after their baby came. Neil was all by himself, up on the hill. Oh, Max and Steve. Remember Steve, the guy with no tear ducts in his eyes, who almost killed Jill by rolfing her? And we all came running because she wouldn't stop screaming. Yeah, Steve would pop over from Vancouver a couple of times during the summer, but the whole idea, the co-op, building a plant nursery, one big family, and raising the kids together, it just evaporated. Ursula passed me her baby, and we walked up to the garden. Neil thought it wasn't right. Everybody holding on to their shares as if Bright Clearing was some kind of condominium. He said if people didn't want to work here, live here, then they should sell out, offer their places to new people. But nobody paid him any heed. Neil was probably right. It isn't fair, but everything changes, doesn't it? Later, I walk up to Neil's place. He'd chosen a spot on the farthest corner of the property, on a rocky bluff jutting out from a copse of pine trees, and where you can just sight the river silvering in the distance below. And everything is precisely in place. His plaid jacket on the hook, the lanterns, the elkhorn cribbage board, a sack of Bull Durham and some rolling papers, tools hanging on the wall, big kettle on the wood stove. I build a fire with wood he'd cut. I grind some beans and brew coffee. Finding his journals is not hard. Neil was not a secretive man. There are 9 of those marble black and white booklets, like the ones we used in grade school, and they're in the glass-gated cabinet he'd built. I roll up a smoke and sit down in Neil's rocking chair. I read rapidly. No one would object to my being here in Neil's place, but I know I'd feel uncomfortable to be discovered poring over his words. I start at the beginning, before I ever arrived there, over the border, beyond the war, even though I mainly want to get to the year I lived up here. I am fearful of not finding myself recollected at all. And naturally, there are many references to Jill, how she was the only soul who truly understood him. Neil wrote that down in several different ways, even in the time after she'd left him. Even after this, the words in his journal. I'm quoting now. Today, Jill said, "Neil, you're only potent from the belly button down." She'll never find out what a bad joke that is. His rejoinder refers back to an entry from several years earlier when he'd gone over to Vancouver for a sperm count, but he had never told Jill she didn't have to use the diaphragm anymore. He was the one who'd wanted a child. There are detailed and anguished accounts of his anger toward Christopher. Chris says he doesn't like neurotics. He doesn't say so, but I know he means me. Chris signed the papers letting Canadian Power build the high-tension lines through the property. It paid off most of the mortgage, but he never even told me. He's just taking over. Chris says I don't understand money. He's right, I guess. And whenever I get back from town, Chris always asks me if I scored. Glenna doesn't even know how much Chris scores on the side. I love their kid so much. Last weekend I took care of the baby while they went to pick peaches in the Okanagan. In the middle of the night, the baby crawled up on my chest and nuzzled at my pecs. It's crazy, but I wish I could nurse like a woman. I think Chris hates it, but the baby really loves me. And finally, I find there are 10 entries about me. He writes, Rick, the new kid, he transplants easily. He's a Dodger who left the States a few years ago. Jill ran into him at a poetry reading in Victoria. I wonder if she's looking for another virgin poet so she can be a muse. That's how she snared me, isn't it? Still in all, Rick seems to have good roots, but I don't know how long he'll last. He's contradicted somehow. He wants to be famous. Ha! Rick helped me cut 2 cords today. He's kind of a lummox with tools, but he's strong for his size and willing. He's a good cribbage player, but he seems always to be bursting with something he wants to tell me, but he can't get it out. Rick never asks me about why Jill left, and I'm glad. I don't think Rick understands women very well. I think he sleeps with Janet because it's the right thing to do. Still in all, that's okay. There are small, tender consolations that come in the darkness. Once, Rick and I saw some Doukhobors burning their place down the other night. He was shocked. I trust their passion. Anyhow, the whole goddamn world's going to go down in flames someday. Today's paper had the story about the fire. The men are in the Nelson jail for arson. I wonder, why can't you burn your own place down? The newspaper always loves it when this happens. That way they get to publish bare-breasted women on the front page. What a great way to defy the government. Just bare your body in front of the courthouse. Those huge Russian bosoms like pink cabbages. I think that everything finally should burn. Rick and I stayed over in New Freedom after the dance. And coming back over the mountain this morning, he waved at that old man. I told Rick how I'd heard once that that man was so old that when he was a boy, he'd made love with Oscar Wilde when Wilde came through here on some lecture tour. And then Rick said something really exotic. Rick said, "So, if we made love with that old man, It's like we'd be connected right back to Oscar Wilde's heart and bones, wouldn't it? He gets some weird thoughts. Still, it was great when the old man waved back at Rick. I'd seen that old coot there for years, sitting in the exact same spot, but I always figured it'd be rude to intrude, even by a greeting. I always figured he wanted to be left totally alone, but damned if the old guy didn't wave back at Rick, and just a tiny little grimace of a smile. And in another entry, Neil wrote, "We had the grand opening of the community center today. It was splendid, joyous. Rick was the auctioneer. I slipped some mescaline into his beer and didn't tell him. It was funny. There he is hollering out the bids. Then he stops in the middle of everything and decides he's going to sing. It was sweet. He got everybody singing. Oh, I see that the path to my cottage grows green, that the place is quite lonely around, and I know that smiles on the faces I once loved now lie in the cool mossy ground. Oh, take me back to the place where I first saw the light." Oh, Rick has a way of battling towards some kind of happiness, but I still can't figure what he truly wants out of life. People say men are better at getting to the point, but I think men only pretend to get the point. I'm always mumbling myself. And in another entry, Neil writes, "Rick came back from town with some psalms the Doukhobors sing. Trouble is, they're all in Russian, in that inverted alphabet. He vows he's going to find somebody to translate them. I'm going to surprise you one of these days," he told me, "and just shout them out." He's curious about the strangest things. And Rick's always laughing, too. It makes me feel light. But he keeps the air vibrating so much that there's not enough space left over for... I can't quite explain. I'm carving a walking stick for Rick. Hazelwood. Sweet fragrance. It'll have to cure for a couple of weeks. It'll be ready for his birthday. He's going to be 24, I think, and says his only claim to fame is that he was an altar boy for the Pope at Yankee Stadium. I ran into that Doukhobor woman, Anna, who's been shunned by her clan. She told me an amazing thing. She says that Bright Clearing is the name of Tolstoy's family home, Vasnaya Polnya. Well, we just came up with that name for this place right out of the blue. Bright Clearing, Vasnaya Polnya. Anyhow, she claims that you can put a piece of hazelwood back in the ground 7 years later, and it'll shoot up green the second spring after. Rick will have to try that someday, when he's old and has time to sit and watch it grow. That's the last entry about me, and I departed for Hollywood in a hurry before my birthday ever came. Never knew Max was carving me a surprise. And I weep a little, and then I cry a whole lot. I haven't cried out like this since Yarrow, my kid sister, withered away so slowly in New Mexico. I searched meticulously through every nook and cranny in Neil's cabin, and outside too. No luck. I can't find any hazelwood stick. I resumed reading the journals. Neil hadn't wanted to be famous or get rich, but there were many pages describing his own ambitions to write a book about going back to the land. He had attempted it for a long time, but had finally given it up. He wrote down, "The words are all here, in my head, in my heart, in my soul. I think some of them are handsome words. They seem shiny to me after all my planing and rubbing, and some ingenious thoughts even. Well, nothing's ever truly original. Insightful sometimes. There are even searing and loving words, I think. But they're beautiful only when they're inside my head. I cannot, damn it, master the art of putting them down on paper And nobody's here anymore to even listen to me say any of them right out loud. I didn't come here to be a hermit, for God's sake. I could see he fiercely tried. His journal described how he tried two-fingered typing on an old Remington, and then tried tape recording his voice, and then transcribing the words, and then tried sketching images of people and animals and trees, and then putting words around the pictures. He explained how he would scale trees right to the topmost branches and perch up there for hours trying to write, or he'd let the canoe drift down the river and write. Yet nothing pleased him. Nothing gives way, he wrote. I find two snapshots of Neil and me. One shows us hammering nails into the shingles of the community center, and the other shows us down by the river, naked. We're sharing a joint, and Neil's hoisting a Molson, and we are laughing at our nakedness. We are handsome and strong, and our eyes hold a measure of love. Is it a fitting irony that Chris was the unseen presence, the man holding the camera? And then the final entry, Christmas Eve, 1985. It reads economically, I want everything obliterated. And now I hear Chris's voice calling out, Rick, are you up here? I step out on Neil's porch. Why didn't you love him more? I shout out. Chris stops on the path below me, face flushing into the roots of his white blonde hair. Why didn't you? He yells back. You're the one who really loved him, eh? But you're just a dodger from the States. No stamina, no staying power, just always nibbling around the edges. And I know what you're doing up here, going through Neil's private stuff. He never wrote down how jealous he was, did he? No, very careful not to mark down his own failings. Well, I wasn't the first to disappoint Neil, but you didn't have the guts to tell him how much you lusted for him, did you? Chris spits through his teeth and starts back down the hill. Hold on, I cried out. Is that my walking stick you're carrying? He turns and glares up at me. That's the Hazelwood Neil carved for me, isn't it? Chris hurls the staff through the air toward me and then turns back down the hill and quickly disappears in the thick woods. I pick up the wooden stem. I feel its heft, touch its knots, examine its grain. This is the closest I will ever get to Neil's hands. Its crook comfortably fits the grip of my palm, and there is an inscription. Rick's staff, cut and cured, Neil. I place my hands on the staff and vault into the air, legs aloft and quavering. My hands are trembling beneath my own weight, but the hazelwood keeps me stable, just long enough to feel exalted as I look at the world upside down, and then I fall back and land on my feet. I use Neil's journals as tinder. I undress myself and place my clothing gently on the gathering flames. Naked, I walk round the burning cabin and sing out the meaning of the Duke of War psalm, which I had promised Neil long ago. Calm me, Lord, quieter than the waters. Humble me lower than the grass. Strengthen me stronger than a precious stone. And you, Lord, strike me, quench life's flame within me. Make me able, Lord, to understand everything. I depart only with the 2 snapshots and the hazelwood walking stick. I leave the blaze behind me. I recross Kootenai Lake on the last ferry of the next night. I recross the 49th parallel just as the guards are beginning to lower the international barrier at Polebridge. Nobody knows how warm I am. Nobody knows I'm naked. Life should happen at the very last minute. This is a journey on the time-space continuum. Your father died this morning, she tells me. His wife, my mother, released from her imprisonment, and my father released from his own. I happened to be on the telephone in the gatekeeper's cottage at a Trappist monastery on the Sacramento River in Northern California. This mortal news is not unexpected. My father has been hospitalized for several days with an intestinal blockage. He is 77. His mind has been blocked for many years now. My older brother and our sisters are down there. I say to my mother, well, should I come down? Do you want me to come down? Do you need me? I wanted my mother to say, no. And she said, no, there's no need really. You saw Dad last year, and the others are here. Well, all right then. I'll have the monks say a mass for him up here. Are you all right? Oh, I'm doing all right. I went to the cemetery yesterday and bought a gravesite. It was only $600. My mother always relishes a bargain. Is it in the shade, I ask? Nothing is in the shade down here. You know that. I do not like the reality of him lying in the hot Florida sun until kingdom come. Dad should be up in Mary Rest. Yes, Mary Rest, up in the shade, back up in the third healthiest town in the United States, where we came from, so long, long ago. Well, did the cemetery give you a 2-for-1 deal, Mom? I was only joshing, poking fun at her. Oh no, it's just the one plot. I don't know where I'll die anyhow. I could be anywhere. I can hear the blush in her voice because she has only purchased the one grave. Well, I respond, there's no rule you have to be buried next to him, right? Yes, she replies, till death us do part. Always the gallows humor in our family. She puts my older sister, Patricia, on the phone. And my sister says, I can't believe you're not coming down here. You didn't love him, did you? She is hurt and insulted somehow. Of course I loved him. I'm not certain this is absolutely correct. I tried to love my father. I pretended to love my father. I pretend I love almost everyone. It's better than nothing. I hear my mother in the background now. She is worrying about daytime rates for long-distance calling. And so we say goodbye. Mother says, well, take care of yourself. Ye know not the day nor the hour. Mother has about 3 lines from the New Testament which she relies on when the occasion arises. And the truth will set you free. But I enjoy it more when she spots a familiar obituary and remarks, well, you're a long time dead. I am on a retreat, and the monks here, the Trappists, leave you alone, and they expect to be left alone. Still, I sense they are looking me over, wondering if I might be one of those timely drop-ins, somebody who might stay with them forever. One of the monks is assigned to answer any questions, hear your confession. The monk assigned to me is named Michael, Father Michael. He seems austere, distant. I follow their routines, and the best part for me is the singing. I arise at 2 in the morning, enter the dimly lighted chapel. I try not to be too obvious as I steal glances at the faces inside their hoods. We sing the Psalms in plain chant, back and forth across the choir stalls. We sing. In the morning, I help with chores. I paint walls in the guest house, rake prunings from the orchard, scrub floors. I tell Father Michael that my father has died, and he says, I'll remember him at my Mass tomorrow morning. Do you want to take communion? Do you need to make a confession? I shake my head. Negative. I am not going to tell this man my sins. I think he might relish them. I do not wish to be the cause of scandal, no matter how minor or private. There is another retreatant, a man from Baltimore. We talk quietly in the guest house. He drives a delivery truck, Coca-Cola. And I discover that he has come all the way across the country on the Greyhound bus to visit this monastery. He tells me he has wanted to become a silent monk since he was 16, and now he is more than twice that age. I've got another interview with the spiritual director later. I think this may be it. I think they're going to let me stay. He is a simple man, without guile. All he wants to do is make his devotions, the simple litanies, to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, to Mary, God's mother. I love the Sacred Heart, and I'm devoted to Mary because she watches out for me. I'm a good worker too. Strong. I can stick with it. I know I can. All I need is the chance. I walk out through the walnut orchards. Their geometry is exquisite. There are almost 2,000 mature trees, and once amongst their leafy midst, you lose any sense of direction. You hear the occasional plop, plop, and plop as ripe walnuts strike the soft earth. And once I gave out with a damn when I took one right on the forehead, and then I heard a chuckle and turned to see the flicker of a cowl, and I turned the other way so as not to intrude on the monk's meditation. I emerge from the orchard. The Sacramento River is brown. I sit in the brush and watch the water moving. And upstream I see Joe, the Coca-Cola truck driver. He is trying to skip stones, but the river is not still enough for anything more than 2 hops. Joe waves and walks down to my side. Shyly he asks, "Would you tell a rosary with me?" I cannot refuse. "You bet I will, Joe." He scoops a chain of wooden beads out of his dungarees and asks, "Which mysteries should we tell? The sorrowful mysteries, the glorious, or the joyful?" "How about the glorious?" I respond. Joe smiles radiantly. "That's exactly the ones I wanted." He dashes down to the river, dips his hand in the water, and blesses himself. He dips his hand in a second time, and laughing, flicks water in my face. A blessing. Joe's own blessing. And bead by bead, we tell out the litany of those mysterious events. Christ rising from the dead and ascending into heaven, the Holy Ghost descending into the midst of the apostles, the moment when Mary was lifted into heaven and then crowned as queen. Just as we complete the final doxology, "Glory be to God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as it is now, and as it will be forever, so be it." There is a great rustling commotion in the reeds and brush across the river. We look up, and 2 giant birds are beating their wings, rising up slowly into the air, like 747s, so big it's hard to imagine they can lift themselves up into the sky. "California condors!" Joe shouts. He is exultant. There's almost none of them left in all creation. Praise God. It's a good sign, don't you think? I agree. It's a very good sign, Joseph. Joe looks at his watch. I better get a move on. It's time for my appointment. Good luck, Joe. So be it, right? Amen, brother. He grasps my hand. Later, when I return to the guest house, Joe's look tells all. He will not be staying. "God, I've tried everything," he explains to me. "This is the 6th monastery that didn't want me. I even told the brother about the condors we saw, how they must have been a sign. You know what he said? He said they were only turkey vultures." There are a few tears rolling down Joe's cheek. I wish I were an abbot. I would have let Joe come into my monastery. His prayers would have saved me. And the next morning, Joe is already gone. I go to Mass. I pray for my father. I take communion without going to confession. I am without faith. Whenever I take communion, I think darkly of flesh eating. Why should I be consuming the body and blood of a holy man? I walk out into the walnut orchard. I am singing softly. Then I see his body. Joe is hanging from a tree. I take him down and lay him on the ground. I kiss his forehead, brush his hair back. He is still warm. I hurry back to the main building. I tell Father Michael, and several monks walk out with me. We carry Joe's body back to the guest house. The doctor comes from the nearby town. He examines the body, signs the death certificate. Brother John, the gatekeeper, makes a number of telephone calls. When he is done, he tells Father Michael, his family says it is all right if we bury him here. So Joe gets his wish. He is allowed to remain, and there is a funeral mass the following morning. The monks even dress poor Joe in a lay brother's habit, and after the mass, the monks wrap Joe in a shroud, and we bury him in the small plot of monks' graves. I return to the guest house, cram my stuff in my backpack. I go to Father Michael. I'm angry. I say, you couldn't even believe that he saw a California condor. He was just a simple guy. He would have made a good monk. You have your own romantic visions, Father Michael responded. Surely a man who is stable enough to endure this life would not hang himself from a tree just because I told him the difference between a condor and a turkey vulture. I walk several miles to the interstate highway. My hitchhiking arm and smile leap out at sparse semis. It's a tough place to catch a ride. I take a book from my pack, The Myth of the Birth of the Hero. Hours pass. I look at the messages scrawled on the light stanchion, words left by other hitchhikers. One in particular catches my eye. The trip to paradise is first and foremost a journey on the time-space continuum. 3 days later, I am in Florida. My father's grave is still covered with astroturf. I roll it up and put it aside. And then I plant the sprigs of ground cover I'd collected from the landscaping on the California freeway. I've taken care to keep the roots damp. The leaves remain green. My father will be shaded now. Yes, some wandering Jew can cover a multitude of sins. The second story this evening is entitled, As the Train of Life Nears the Depot Called Incommunicado, Prepare to Jump. Not so long ago, my elder sister's mental spirits began to flag. Her body was very tired, exhausted from 2 mastectomies and from bearing 8 children into the world. She was enduring fear and confusion and had been forced to relinquish her job as director of social work at a large hospital. "Tell me what's going on," she pleaded. My brother and I listened. "I'm very frightened, very nervous. I just want to know what's really going on." One of us asked, "How can we help you be less frightened?" Our hearts thudded when she quietly replied, "You could simply take my life." She looked directly at me as she spoke those words. But we left that plea alone, and I never told her husband, my brother-in-law. I believe hers was a genuine request to be helped in departing this mortal sphere. But it was far too difficult to respond, to take action. 4 years have passed now. Her loving husband and faithful children must feed her and bathe her and change her clothing. We can still make her laugh, although she cannot carry on a conversation and she has no memory. I can still see her 45 years ago, leaping up and down, captain of the cheerleaders at St. Luke's, urging the team on to victory. "Go back, go back, go back to the woods, 'cause you haven't got the goods. You haven't got the rhythm, and you haven't got the jazz, and you haven't got the team that St. Luke's has." When I think about my own mortality, perhaps my grittiest fear is to lose my ability for memory, language, and understanding. I too want to know what's really going on. I do not wish to be lost in the stratosphere like my own dad was also lost in the last 5 years of his life. No longer able to write letters to the editor, recite Shakespeare, play bridge, read history, and sing the old songs off-key with me. Gone forever from his mind were the stories we all cherished about marching off to the First World War with the fair and square boys marching in Chowder Society. The night the market crashed in 1929 and he and his pals got tanked up and burned their useless stock certificates. And the days in the 1950s when he testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Racketeering. Nevermore would Dad be able to read me aloud about Ulysses and Penelope. And no longer would he remind me of Polonius' advice to his son in Hamlet. "This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man." Fortunately, amid Dad's terrible confusion, there was still room for tenderness when I visited and we walked the beach and swam in the Atlantic together. When he became too heavy a burden on my mother, he would come and visit me for a fortnight. I had all his medications. Sometimes, when he'd cry out in anguish, not knowing where he was or even who I was, I'd stare at his supply of tranquilizers. It's an awesome responsibility to end, or even consider helping to end the life of someone we love. Fortunately, I never had to choose. One day, my mother heard the car start. She rushed outside to see my father speeding up the street. He hadn't driven in years. She called the sheriff. We found out later that he'd gotten on the Sunshine State Parkway and sped north. What place or memory could he have been pursuing? He refused to stop for the cops who, sirens blaring and hands waving, were trying to stop him for speeding. Pop only pulled over when the car ran out of gas. Yes, Pop was finally out of gas, and he died, peaceably enough, in a hospital a few weeks later. Upon reflection, one of us might say, well, it's all in the woof and the warp. Life and death are difficult. Let nature take its course. Let the larger spirits prevail and take us away in all good time. But it's not the good time that any of us wish to avoid. No, it's the unremitting pain and exhaustion, the terrible fears arising from no longer knowing who in the name of God we are, or who we even were, not recognizing the mates and children and sweet friends who stood by our sides for so many, many years. I want to die as peacefully as I can. A few years back, I made my annual journey to South Florida. My mother is 83. Her brother, Uncle Dan, is 91. And in my journal, I write, now the century and Uncle Dan have started into their 90s. I gently clip my mother's toenails, fry up some lamb chops, harangue her about the volume on the television, and I skip the trip to Dad's grave. I never imagined getting out of Florida alive. Even the weather there is old. My own simple pine box, made from a kit purchased a decade ago from Montana's Sweet Earth Casket and Cradle Company, is resting and waiting in a cow barn down the Paradise Valley near Yellowstone. Time like the clouds, banks and drifts and then scuds down the mountainsides. Life is a beautiful natural disaster, and I'm seduced by its tarnished sterling catastrophes. Torrents, droughts, or forest fires, the banquet unfolds. Linen and silver only, please. No disposables, not even me. The only time I ever read a weather report is when I'm outside Montana, chanting my prayer, "Dear God, don't let me die away from my own latitude." The fear I have about losing my mind to senility is that by the time I realize I'm hurtling down the track toward the depot called Incommunicado, by the time I've already been stranded on the far shores of human intercourse, it will already be too late to stop this awful train, and I won't be able to disembark without help. That is why I am already preparing for such a journey, why friends and family are already empowered to assist me when I can no longer assist myself in crossing the final river. That moment when I can no longer recognize that the station stop I was looking for has arrived, and that those who assist me are forever held blameless for their action, and not to be penalized by the state for knowing and loving me well enough to be the guardian angels I choose now, today.